Every NFL season, there are always new head coaches who enter the hot seat. So today, I want to talk about every single head coach and putting them on a tier list and ranking them based on how close I think they are to being fired. So for this list, I have 7 different categories: the locked category, safe unless something catastrophic were to happen category, first year head coach category, questions but still pretty safe category, stove is on category, starting to boil category, and lastly, the boiling category. We're going to go through every single head coach, so let's just hop into it. First up, Raheem Morris, one of my favorite hires of this cycle of head coaches. I think he's going to do a fantastic job with an already super talented Atlanta Falcons team. Raheem Morris has everything you want in a head coach. I think it's finally time he displays his abilities on a massive team like the Atlanta Falcons. I think there's so much talent on that team that they could be super good next year. Sean McVay, I think, is as close to being safe as you can get. He's one of the best offensive minds out there. I think his team is very good. They had a fantastic draft last year. Had they not had the year they had last year with all the talent, I would maybe feel okay with saying Sean McVay is in the safe unless something catastrophic happened category. But given the fact of how good that team was last year and where I think this team is going with a lot of their younger talent, I feel pretty safe to put him in this locked category. Next up, Mike McDaniel. I'm going to put him in safe unless something catastrophic happens. He's a head coach who, in my opinion, has all the offensive tools to get the job done. Good wide receivers, a good enough quarterback, a good enough run game. Offensive line has some major issues, but they're going to address that hopefully in this year's draft. The questions for me really come on the defensive side of things with a lot of new players entering this team. Can they fit the system? Can they make it work? I think this team's going to take a small step back next year, but I've seen some people say they're going to have less than 9 wins next year. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think unless this team were to lose 15 games next year, then he might get fired, but I think he's pretty safe. Dave Canales, another one of my favorite hires of this first year head coach cycle. He's an offensive-minded guy who's going to help Bryce Young develop. I think this is a pretty safe hire for the Carolina Panthers. I shouldn't say safe. It's a pretty well thought out hire that I think makes a ton of sense to a developing quarterback such as Bryce Young. Gerard Mayo, same sort of vibe here. Andy Reid, I don't really feel like I have to explain Andy Reid all that much. He just won back-to-back Super Bowls. There's a good chance he wins a third one this year. It's Andy Reid. Antonio Pierce, I'm not going to put him in the first year head coach because technically he was the coach for like 90% of last year. I think he's pretty safe. I think that this is a Raiders team that doesn't really have low expectations next year, but also doesn't have super high expectations. If this team goes out there and makes a playoff spot, then that's fantastic, but I think it's pretty obvious where this Raiders team is kind of heading. They're definitely heading in the right direction now. I think Antonio Pierce is a big reason why for that. I'd be shocked if he got fired after only 1 year. Next up, we have Brian Callahan, first year head coach. Not my favorite hire. I don't really love the hire. I honestly would have just kept Mike Vrabel, but that's just my opinion. Mike McDaniel, I like this hire a lot. I think these are pretty good hires. Dan Campbell, his job's safe. Could have made it to the Super Bowl last year. I think there's a good chance they make it this year. They're a loaded roster, and they're only going to keep getting better. Mike Tomlin, I think the stove is on for Mike Tomlin. He's a head coach who hasn't really had a breakout year in quite some time. Like, his teams have consistently made the playoffs and consistently done okay to decent, but they're never going to win the big one. And I think this year, with some new quarterbacks, with some new pieces on this roster, and hopefully a successful draft, this team should be heading in the right direction. And I think if Mike Tomlin can't get this team to at least the second round of the playoffs, I think there's a chance he does get fired off this team. There is some historic value and some sentiment with him in the franchise, so that's why I have him not in the boiling category, but I think he's getting there. Doug Peterson, similar sort of things here with a lot of head coaches we're going to talk about in a little bit. Didn't have a good year at all last year. Had a great year the year before, a year where they broke a ton of expectations, but obviously last year with expectations, they weren't able to meet that. With a really good division that's becoming very freaking good, Doug Peterson has a challenging task ahead of him. It's going to be competing against the likes of the Indianapolis Colts, the Houston Texans, and now even the Tennessee Titans. If he's not able to reach the expectations of that team, I think there's a chance he does get fired, but for now, I'm going to keep him in the stove is on category unless something really bad were to happen. Not necessarily catastrophic, but not very good. So if this team were to win 8 games next year and miss the playoffs, I think he could get fired. John Harbaugh, brother of Jim Harbaugh, who is right here. We'll just throw him in there for the sake of it. I like this hire too, by the way. John Harbaugh, pretty safe. He's always been successful with the Baltimore Ravens. There's a historic sentiment on that team. Unlike Mike Tomlin, he's had a lot of success these past couple years, winning a lot of playoff games and just not quite getting over that hump of being able to make that deep playoff run. I think now he has the really weird constructed roster, but I think as it sits, I feel confident enough in him and his abilities to at least win 10 plus games. So I think as long as he does that, he's going to keep his job. And I don't think that even if he were to lose, I don't know, 8, 9 games, I still think he's pretty safe to keep his job. Brian Dable, I think that he is starting to boil. He's somebody who had a really good first year, kind of like Doug Peterson, and a really bad previous year, just the most recent year. I think if this team does not perform up to expectations, whether that's his fault or not, I think he's going to get the blame for it. I think they're going to fire him to move on to a different guy. I really think that he's a good head coach, and I don't think that they should fire him, but I also wouldn't be shocked if the New York Giants got a little impatient with him and decided to fire him. Dan Quinn, first year head coach. I think it's going to be interesting to see what that Commanders team does. It's a fun Commanders team with a lot of really good pieces, but I just don't know if Dan Quinn's the right guy to lead that team. I'm very intrigued to see how this one turns out. Sean Payton, I think he's pretty safe. I think the expectations is that next year Denver is going to be one of the worst teams out there. The Denver Broncos team that doesn't have a quarterback, doesn't have a very good offensive line, doesn't have a very good defense. A whole lot of pieces for him to work with, and I think unless this team were to win like 0 games or 1 game, then I think he's probably going to keep his job. He's a very successful head coach. Last year was not a true sign of what he is, and I think next year won't be a sign either. I think this team is going through a full rebuild, so I think it will be pretty interesting. Next up, we have D'Amico Ryans. He's pretty safe. I'm honest. He's not going to lose his job. Even if next year they fail to make the playoffs, he's still going to keep his job. He's one of the best head coaches out there. Had a very successful year last year with the Houston Texans. Led a team that had no business making the playoffs. I think he's only going to continue to get better as a head coach, so I'm pretty safe putting him in the locked category. Then we have Matt Eberflus. I'm going to put him in boiling. After a couple of seasons now with the Chicago Bears, hasn't gotten anything done, has been very mediocre as a head coach. Now he's going to have genuine talent on his roster like Caleb Williams, another player in the top 10 of this year's draft. You have a good wide receiving core. Your defense is getting better. If this team does not make a big jump next year, and by big jump, I mean, I don't know, getting close to making the playoffs, I think his job security is gone and out the window, and they're probably going to look to hire a new, more successful head coach. Next up, Shane Steichen. I think he's a lock to keep his job. Last year, that was a Colts team that overperformed like crazy, and I think now he's going to have his quarterback healthy, hopefully for the full year. That's already a very good Indianapolis Colts roster, so I think as long as they perform up to expectations and Anthony Richardson doesn't take a dramatic step back from what we saw him last year, I think it's pretty safe to say he's going to keep his job, and I don't even think anything catastrophic could happen to this team. If something catastrophic were to happen, he's still not going to lose his job. He's pretty safe to keep his job, so I feel pretty safe on that one. Mike McCarthy, probably the water that's boiling the most. 3 successful regular seasons, winning 12 games in each season. Nothing good has come from it. They haven't won any championships. They've only won 1 playoff game under Mike McCarthy. Now there's a ton of questions about the roster. Dak Prescott might be losing his job next year, which is kind of crazy. I think for this Cowboys team, this is the first time in quite some time that I just feel like there's a lot of hope that isn't there on this roster. Like there's really no reason for this team to have hope because they just aren't a very well constructed roster right now. And I think Mike McCarthy not getting the job done with some really good teams definitely has his job security in question. And I think if this team fails to win a couple playoff games this year, his job is screwed. And I kind of feel bad for him because the Cowboys front office isn't giving him anything to work with this free agency class, but he also hasn't really done anything with the talent he's already had. So I kind of get it. Next up, Jonathan Gannon. I think that he's pretty safe as a head coach. Last year, with a horrible team, they were still pretty competitive, mainly on the defensive side of things. And I'm excited to see what this team can do now that you get Kyler Murray, potentially a guy like a Marvin Harrison Jr. on this roster. I think he's pretty safe unless this team were just to be really bad. Actually, you know, I'm going to move him to the questions, but still pretty safe category. I think he's pretty safe, but I think there's a couple questions. I don't think he's going to lose his job by no means, but I think if this team doesn't win like 6-7 games, I think he could get fired. So I don't think he's quite anything catastrophic, but I think if he were to lose more games than he thinks he should lose, I think it could be interesting. Except Todd Bowles, put him in, this is a tough one because if you were to ask me last year, I'd put him in one of these 3, but after a year of making the playoffs and having a successful run, I'm going to put him in questions, but still pretty safe. I think as long as this team performs up to their expectations, which is making the playoffs, I think he's going to keep his job. But if he doesn't, I think he could get fired. That's why I'm kind of in the middle here because I think he's kind of in the middle of like get fired or he could also keep his job. It's kind of a weird one to kind of hear. Next up, Kevin Stefanski. I think he's pretty safe. This is a Browns team that has expectations, but I don't know if their expectations are to like win a championship. I think their expectations are to make a playoff and maybe make a playoff run. He hasn't quite been able to do that, so I think he's pretty safe unless something catastrophic were to happen, such as missing the playoffs or just really underperforming next year with some healthy players. Kevin O'Connell, I'm going to put him in kind of the same tier list as some of these other guys. He's a very good head coach in my opinion, and I think Minnesota realizes that. I feel like they mesh really well together with the direction of the team and Kevin O'Connell. This team has a lot of questions at quarterback, and I think they all understand where they're going as a franchise. So I think as long as Kevin O'Connell doesn't just, drop the bag completely, I think he's pretty safe overall. Then we have Matt LaFleur. I think he's a lock to keep his job. I know that Packers fans always have concerns with Matt LaFleur, but I think he's one of the best head coaches out there. Last year, he overperformed with a roster that, in my opinion, wasn't ready to compete with Jordan Love in his first year. Three young receivers, a mediocre offensive line, a defense that underperformed, yet they still made the playoffs, beat the Dallas Cowboys, and probably could have beat the San Francisco 49ers had it not been a catastrophic ending. I think he's pretty safe. He's going to keep his job. Even if this team doesn't make the playoffs next year, he's still going to keep his job because he's a damn good head coach. Then we have Nick Sirianni. And boy, that water is boiling. If that team does not perform up to expectations by the week of next year, he could lose his job. In my opinion, all these head coaches here on the bottom, if they're not performing, there's going to be a lot of these head coaches who could get fired for a guy like a Bill Belichick or a Mike Vrabel. Nick Sirianni has one of the most talented rosters out there. That is an Eagles team that offensively has everything you want. Good offensive line, good running back, good receivers, good quarterback, good tight end. Defensively, there's some concerns still there, but I still think it's not that bad. I still think as long as the system's good, they should be fine. Robert Saleh, I'm going to put him in starting to boil. I think that team has a lot of expectations, and I think if they don't reach those expectations, he's going to lose his job. However, I don't think he's quite yet in boiling because I think he's done a very good job of coaching the defense. So I think he's done his end of the deal. It's just been the offense hasn't been up to expectations, which ultimately does lie on his shoulders. I do have some concerns about the health and the age of that roster, but as long as I think that team performs up to expectations, he'll keep his job. But if they don't, and they miss the playoffs or don't make that playoff run they think they can, he could lose his his head coaching job. Then you have Dennis Allen. I want to put him in boiling. I don't know how the New Orleans Saints franchise feels about him, but I know for myself, I think he's a horrible fit and a horrible head coach for that New Orleans Saints team. I think he's a good coordinator, not a good coach or head coach. I'm interested to see what that team does this year with obviously a worse roster, but I'm interested. I think that Dennis Allen's not a good head coach, and I think that it's pretty safe to say that if he doesn't perform up to expectations next year, which I think the expectations are to make the playoffs and maybe have a good successful regular season, if he's not able to do that, he's going to lose his job. Next up, we have Sean McDermott. This is an interesting one. I think that the stove is on for McDermott. Last year, there were some rumors about him potentially losing his job because of the things he said, and then they went on to have a very good, successful end of the season last year. I think if they're not able to repeat some of the success they had late in last year, I think there's a good chance he loses his job. And then kind of similar to a guy like Mike McCarthy, this offseason has been kind of brutal to the Bills. They've lost a lot of talent, but I also think they've done a decent job of bringing in new assets and new pieces to fix up this roster. So I still feel like there's a roster here that they could still make the playoffs and make a deep playoff run. If Sean McDermott doesn't keep up his end of the deal, though, I think he will get fired. Next up, Kyle Shanahan. This is tough because he's been super successful when his teams are healthy, but he's never been able to get the job done. And sometimes it's his fault, right? I'm not going to put the blame on him for the Super Bowl losses, but sometimes they are his fault. And I want to put him in lock because he's such a good offensive-minded head coach, but I could also see a world where San Francisco's like, we have a talented team that we can bring in any head coach, and they can get us over the hump. I just want to put him in lock so badly, but I'm going to put him in safe unless something catastrophic happens category. My philosophy for that one is that I think if this San Francisco 49ers team doesn't make expectations next year, like let's say they miss the playoffs or they are a first round exit, I think that he could be sort of I don't know how to word it, but he could sort of be the fallback guy. Like, who are we going to blame? Oh, we're going to blame Kyle Shanahan. I think if that's the case, he could get fired. I think it's very unlikely, but I think unless a complete catastrophe of that team happens, he could get fired. And last up, we have Zach Taylor. After a disappointing year last year, I think his job security isn't quite as safe as it used to be. I think there's questions, but I still think he's pretty safe. Obviously, they had that Super Bowl run. They've been very successful as a team. There's obviously some good connections within the building. I think Cincinnati's not necessarily in a rush to fire him, but if this team doesn't meet expectations next year, which you've obviously heard me say expectations a lot, but if this team doesn't, he could be the fallback guy, kind of like Kyle Shanahan. I think he's a good enough head coach to get the job done for them, but I wonder if the team feels the same way as I do. So I'm going to put him in the questions, but still pretty safe category. And this is going to be our tier list again. You guys can take a quick little look here. And if you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button. I have more content coming up. And if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button. And I hope you guys enjoyed. Peace.